they often times refer to what we do as like very niche, but I don't see it as being that niche. Like there are so many people, like anthropologists, filmmaker, everybody's doing work that's sort of hybrid.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the Current Art Podcast. So today I'm at a very special place in Gowanus, Brooklyn, Labocine. And today I'm bringing in two very special guests. They are the founder, Alexi Gambis from Labocine and Science New Wave, and the curator of the film festival. Hello, and Alexi and Nate, could you please introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, I'm Alexi Gambis. I am a filmmaker and sort of a retired biologist, fruit fly scientist in my early days. I started the festival with a few other people 17 years ago, and I sort of very interested in cultivating the space between scientists, artists, and filmmakers, and also my films as a filmmaker tend to mix scientific research and magical realism, and I'm really interested in science in fiction.
Hi, I'm Nate Dorr. I am the curator of the festival now. Like Alexi, I have a science background. My undergrad was in neuroscience, and I operated a lab for a long time before photography and film curation, and that all converged here. And I curated for a while back from 2013 to 2019. I was involved in other smaller capacities for a while, and I'm back this year. I'm a filmmaker and curator primarily now. Thanks for joining us.
I think there's like really interesting spaces that you cultivated.
Yeah, that was mostly you. I mean, this whole curation of the office.
Well, this is our fourth office, I think, or
I don't know how many were before my time, but
initially the organization was like run out of dorm rooms in the Upper East Side at Rockefeller University. That was where the organization started. It was a bunch of PhD students and postdoctorate fellows that came together and were interested in film and media, and we just had this idea of starting a festival. But we had no real knowledge of none of us really knew what it meant to run a film festival. So that was sort of the early days, but we had the scientists and we had the community, and we could use like the theater, the auditorium at Rockefeller University, and that's how it started. And then at some point we thought it would be great to like expand through New York. And then we had an office it was run out of my apartment in Brooklyn, and then Nate came along. We were in Dumbo. We were in Flatbush first.
Yeah, same building that Mono Noir is in, so lots of film history there.
That's so
lots of rats as well.
Oh, lots of rats. This is so New York.
Yeah, there were some interesting organizations there that some of them have stayed, but there was GenSpace. Do you know GenSpace?
No.
It's sort of like a DIY. It's like a lab for artists where you can learn like basic techniques around like molecular biology, but for people that are not scientists. But they were there. Who else was there?
Nautilus magazine.
Nautilus magazine, which is like sort of a popular science magazine.
So your background is science and film. Like, how did you put these two like major together? How did you put these two different disciplines and together?
Both of us, actually, right?
Yeah.
How was yours? Yeah.
Well, it wasn't together at the same time. I started in science and I moved to film eventually. That was just, I lived in New York. I was working in a lab. At some point, I was curating for the Brooklyn Film Festival and photographing shows and things all around the city. And then I saw this and I was like, oh, the combination of my job and the other things I'm doing in the city will all merge right here. So, and yeah, you were also science to film, I think.
A little bit. I mean, I think a lot of my work was imaging. So I had an interest in filming in the laboratory. A lot of it was just like very visual storytelling. And so I never thought of it so much as like combining it. It was sort of like inherent in the work that I was doing. But I guess the the combining was also making the decision of, maybe leaving the research world and focusing more on like creating scientific narratives as like a career, right? Like kind of leaving aside like the necessity of having to have like results and publish, right? But I merged those two early on, and I mean, I guess my dad's a painter, my mom's a filmmaker, so I had interest in film and imagery and painting, but I never knew how I would translate that into my work until I became a biologist, and then I realized, oh, I'm interested in like, especially microscopes. I was always really interested in microscopy, and so.
Oh,
So yeah.
that's really exciting. Like, have you ever make your first film out of like microscopic images? What was your experience?
Yeah, my first films were all about microscopes. So one of the first films was about a scientist that goes inside a microscope and falls in love with a girl that's like lives in a petri dish. And I shot it on a 16 millimeter on like a Bolex camera, because I was doing my PhD during the day, and at night I would take film classes. But I was also interested in like magical realism. And so, and I would spend hours like filming through microscopes.
In some ways, filmmaking is a natural extension of science. A lot of early film was to visualize, scientific work, shooting time lapses of plants and things like that. So they're always linked, and I don't know. There's so much there that you can reveal through film. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I never thought of it like the necessity to communicate something. I felt like the images and sound kind of would speak for themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like this necessity of like having to, there's a term in French which like scientific communication is called vulgarization. That's like the actual term, vulgarisation. I don't know how it is in German, but it's like this idea that in order to communicate science, you have to like dumb it down. Or you have to have voiceover, you have to like explain, or you have to have talking heads, And I thought like the images and the experiments, they already had so much information, not only as like the data itself, it was like actual data, like mouse behavioral, but they were also like enough as like cinematic experiences. So I never thought of like the necessity to like explain. I thought it would like as standalone, it was like enough. And then if people wanted to learn more about like what is this fruit fly doing in a petri dish, or they would go ahead and like do a little research and try to figure out what these images meant.
That's very powerful. So it's not for educational purposes, but it's more like experimentation.
Yeah, very much. Experiment. Ways of knowing things that are less direct about being told something, but getting to feel it. Which is true of like when I'm making films personally that have nothing to do with science, I still want that. I don't want to tell people things if I can help it. So
yeah, I think and I think there is this term like experimental, which I always had issues with, because it's like, experiments are not necessarily experimental. Like filming experiments. There's this whole like a tendency of like experimental being like non-narrative, and I don't know. I feel like there's a lot to be done like with experiments in terms of like showcasing them and like a sense of awe as well. Like people see things like that you wouldn't necessarily see like under the microscope, for example. There's also something very voyeuristic about experiments, like you're tracking something that perhaps the animal is not seeing, like a surveillance camera, which can be also problematic. But I thought it was like, I thought there was an opportunity for those experiments to be shown outside of just the lab. Yeah.
So do you think this Labocine is also like experiment, and the science new wave is also experiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea was like, is to create entities that allow you to like bring all of this together, right? So a lot of like the naming, like Labocine, like laboratory of cinema, like labo, which means like laboratory, and scene is cinema, or was just like a necessity to find ways to like nomenclature, like articulate And I think it helps the Science New Wave. The reason behind the Science New Wave was that there was a lot of people that would come to us and say like, oh, is what you're doing like science film? Is that a science film? Right, we had a lot of that.
Right,
Like we would have like a performance. Like Nieto, this like French Colombian, he would like do like performance where he would play like music with like a fetus of a pig. Like things that would like shock, but also would like it's all about questioning what are experiments, when does an experiment become like wrong, like when you manipulate it in a way that like it becomes like performance art. Like he would play with that edge where like people would be entertained, but also it's like working with real animals, but it was all like magic show as well. So
yeah, he did a lot with sort of cinematic and performative sleights of hand to make the audience question what they were seeing. Yeah, it was pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and I felt like there was a lot of that, right? There was a lot of like this thing where people would question like, is that really science communication what you're doing? Because people would come up to us in the festival and be like, I don't see any scientific value in what. So I thought it was like, and then sometimes in interviews, people would be like, questions like, what's your favorite science movie? And I was just like, gosh, this question is like, like Gattaca, like Planet of the Apes. So I thought like Science New Wave would be a great way to kind of like divert that question and say like, well, you should read about the Science New Wave. It's like a movement, and it's about bringing together, people that have already been together, to be honest. But it's like a movement which is like about experimentation, about anybody can tell these stories, about sort of diversity, which has been a big part of Imagine Science. Like the programming that Nate has done, it's like there's films from all over the world, right? There can be like a science fiction from Indonesia and like, yeah,
28 countries this year, so yeah.
Wow. And 64 films.
64 films.
So why is 64 films?
Well, that was your creation, but it's the number of total proteins that can be coded for by the genetic code. The amount of amino acids that can be coded for by genetic code and thus create proteins in our bodies.
Yeah, did you know this about the genetic code?
Can you explain it to the people who is like non-scientists?
You want to go for it, or?
Sure. Okay, so you have DNA is made up of 4 base pairs, and every 3 pairs of them is coding for 1 amino acid. Because it's there's 4 of them, it's 3 to the 4th, which is 64. So that's the total number of possibilities you can get from a string of 3 things with 4 possibilities. Some of them are duplicates, so there's not that many amino acids in our body. The same amino acid will be coded for by different codes. But I think there's 20, how many are there?
20 amino acids.
Yeah, it is 20, okay. So the code is read in your body constantly in all your cells. Those amino acids are created based on the code, and then those form together into proteins, which are what govern everything happening in our bodies, essentially. They're the signaling molecules, the parts of the actual structures in there. So yeah, that's how DNA codes for everything. And thus, that's a basic, that 64 possibilities is a nice metaphor for the many, many possibilities in science film that can come out of a small set of things. So. That's my understanding.
That's the idea, is that like when you make a film, you have a script, right? And that script, or maybe you don't have a script, but you have some sort of blueprint, and that codes for image and sounds, and maybe live performance if there's like a live component, right? And so we wanted to take those rules of like biology and we wanted to sort of like translate them into film. So the idea is that like every film is basically the basis for a protein, which would be, or an amino acid. An amino acid is just like the base, the unit of a protein, right? It's like one single. So we're taking those ideas and we're like translating them into film. Actually, this term of like converting DNA or RNA into proteins is called translation. I mean, that is the term scientifically. And so, it's like sort of very powerful to think. And the idea is also to create limitations, right? Like, let's focus on selecting like just a set number of films.
So those biological knowledge became a guideline of the curation, right? If I understand correctly.
It just gave us a form, a structure to work within. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, we're not making any decisions based on. I mean, there are some, but like it can be any form, right? It can be short, medium length, feature, fiction, science fiction, documentary, experimental. Like we're not like we don't have like a set number. I mean, obviously we want like a diverse array of the genetic code, but like we're not a festival that purely programs documentary or science fiction. But the science new wave and the genetic code is like they're guiding principles, right? They like allow us to like refer back to that for the programming, but also for people. Like when they say like, what exactly do you do? I think it's also good for people if they want to learn more to like read up on it and say like, oh, okay, science new wave, and also potentially not agree with it. You know what I mean? Like there's like a dialogue, like, oh, I like this because there's like traits in the science new wave, and so there's people that say like, well, I don't really understand what you mean by this trait, or
I get emails about these
we
sometimes.
get these like, but that's good because it's like I agree. It's like there's no like, and it also means that there's like a conversation, right? And so that's how it started. But science new wave has been relatively new. It's like maybe 3-4 years.
Yeah, so the festival was the Imagine Science Film Festival for years. And at some point, I kind of thought, oh, that sounds too educational. It's not really representing what we do anyway. And then, yeah, you switched it a couple years ago. How did that actually happen?
Well, actually, it happened because when we were in Dumbo, there was an article that came out, like it was like a blog, and they used the term, I think, like the science new wave.
Well, that's because you probably said it in an interview.
I don't know if I said it. I don't know what, like if it was, yeah, I'm not sure where it came out of. I mean, of course, it comes from the French New Wave because, you know, and I happen to be French. I don't know if that, but the idea was the French New Wave, the principle of it, although many of the people that were behind the New Wave were against the term New Wave, like Godard hated. Actually, the New Wave was like was a magazine that kind of coined the term for him, and he was always against the. But the idea of the French New Wave was to like to kind of like respond to specific archetypes of how film was being made in the 60s, you know, and to like shake it up a little bit. And so these films that were coming out of the New Wave, we often think about the New Wave as filmmakers, but they weren't only filmmakers. There was anthropologists, economists, and they would meet up in what was called the cinema club in France, and it wasn't only filmmakers in the room, you know. And so many of these films, like Alain René, collaborated with scientists in making this film called My American Uncle. There was all kinds of collaborations and all about like rebelling against the industry. And so I thought it would be a good term for the science new wave because it was, in a way, like responding to that, but also coming back to what Nate was saying, like the early films that were made were all like time lapses of plants and the birth of a flower, and like these were the films that were made. So we're just kind of coming back to the beginnings as well. So.
I have a question, like how do you connect with your audience? Like, are your audiences, for example, science lover, film lover? Like, how do you, like...
Both.
Both.
Yeah, I remember one of the years we took a poll where people had to say whether they were scientists, filmmakers, or other, and I think it was 1/3 each.
Yeah.
So it's all over the place, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think we tend to attract... Yeah, it's hard to know. Like, it tends to be a lot of like, I don't know. It's hard to like categorize, but tends to be on the younger side, I would say. Like people that are like postdoc. Like in the science world, we attract a lot of like graduate students and postdocs, not necessarily established or like PIs or.
If you're a postdoc, you're in the lab all the time, and so this idea of like how do you get out of the lab, get your message out, reach other people. Some people, you know, there's sort of celebrity science bloggers who have Instagrams where they're getting out of the lab and presenting what they're doing to a wider audience. And we're another way of doing that. Yeah. It's, you know, yeah, it's an opportunity to actually talk to other people and stop just being stuck behind a lab bench all day.
And many of these scientists, if you speak to them, like the people that you spoke to, like Sharoma, they are musicians, they're illustrators. I mean, some of them are our friends, right? they're like neuroscientists or, you know, or whatever, like biophysicists, but they're also artists, you know, they also have like interest in like, oh no, I'm a musician, I'm a composer, or I'm an animator, or like.
I think one of the most annoying sort of pop psychology features is the idea of being left-brained or right-brained. There's no division. Everyone has creative and analytical aspects of their personality. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
So scientists aren't one thing. They're also artists, of course. You know,
Yeah.
Everyone has multiple interests.
And of course, it's a similar process, right? If you're in a lab all day long, trying to like devise experiments and a story that you can sort of tell by putting together experiments. I mean, it's a story, it's factual, but it's still a story, a narrative. I mean, it's very similar to the artistic process. I mean, it's like you also have a technique that you have to learn, the same as being a filmmaker. You have to learn how to use a camera or lighting or sound engineering, whatever, but it's the same. I mean, in the lab, you have to learn how to do like a Western blot, a DNA prep, use the microscope. But you're also kind of like wandering into like uncharted territories, right? Like you don't really know where you're heading. You wake up every morning as a scientist and you're like, okay, I'm going to run these experiments that may, same as a filmmaker, like that may fail. You may like film on 16 millimeter and realize that your film is like overexposed, underexposed. Or, it's the same process.
Very true.
It's a very similar. And so for me, I don't know how it was for you, it was very natural to start making films. Didn't feel like a switch. I mean, it felt like a switch more in like, you know, on a social level, like, or like maybe economic, like figuring out how I was going to make a living doing that, but not on like a practical, like what I was doing. You know? The way in which these career, I mean, less now perhaps, but when I was a PhD student, like the idea of making films or engage, like it was sort of like unheard of, you know, like if you're doing a PhD, it's like, this is what you need to do. Like you need to do a postdoc, so when I decided to like leave that world, it was not easy. There was a lot of resistance, like from people that were like on my PhD committee. They were just not understanding, like, what, you want to leave the research world and you want to make films, like you're wasting a career. And so we also exist as a way to show people that that this community exists and that there's a lot of people that, and there's also like a lot of issues both in the artistic world, but in the science world, right? In terms of, you know, compensation to graduate students, you know, they get paid very little money to be a postdoc and you're like in your mid-30s already. There's a lot of pressure to publish in big magazines. It's very stressful. There are very few positions to run a lab. You're competing with a lot of people. I mean, it's tough. And it was definitely not something that I wanted to do. So
that sounds like the artist world as well.
It's very similar, yeah. And when you become a PI, you have to apply for grants. You no longer necessarily, I mean, you can spend a little time in the lab, but most of the work as like a head of a lab, PI means like principal investigator, is you have to fund your lab.
You become an administrator.
You become an administrator.
An actual, you know, creator of the work. So. That's one of the reasons I got out of it. I didn't want to end up there.
And trust me, to get a grant from like the NSF or the NIH, it's so much paperwork. It takes them months. So next time you speak to like a head of a lab, most likely they'll tell you like, oh, I've been working on this grant for the last 4 weeks. That's all. That's their main job is to make sure that their lab is funded.
Is that like national grants, like from the United States?
Yeah, NSF.
Yeah, they can sometimes get private grants as well from like private institutions, but
sometimes those are weird conflicts of interest, though.
Sometimes they're weird, and sometimes the research has to be separated because like if you're doing stem cell research, for example, you may not be able to use public funding, but you can use private funding, so you have to separate it in the lab. If you get money from like pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies, yeah, it's the fun part is when you're a graduate student, right? Because you're actually doing the research. You can sort of still have a little bit of like creativity. You are worrying about the next steps, but I feel like as you get closer to that postdoc, which is the next step, then life gets stressful because you're also like older, you know, you're trying to like stabilize, have a family. I mean, all of this, and it's like, we know a lot of postdocs that like have existential crisis about like, is this what I want to do? Is it's just like not sustainable, and I make like $3,000 a month, you know.
Yeah, I guess that's also my problem, that this existential questions that I have all the time. Am I doing something that is making sense to the world, making sense to my own life, and how do I self-fund it? How do I like contribute to other areas of the society?
Yeah.
So I think the Labocine is a very smart intellectual solution about this like existential crisis. Yeah,
Thank you.
because instead of building a very rigid system, that you actually build a very nourishing ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the goal, was to connect people through the wider part of Labocine. So Labocine is partly, it's the video magazine that's monthly, that's sort of a complement to the festival. A lot of filmmakers and films from the festival end up contributing to that as well later, and it's a way to expand their message. But the other side of that is something called Habitat, which is where it's really designed as a platform so that people can share their work with others and find collaborators through this creative ecosystem.
That's true. They are not only sharing the works they already made related to science and film, but they also share their field notes with each other. So people can really see the work in progress and what they're really interested in very specific field.
Yeah, and that's very new. Like field notes is maybe like 2 months old, but it's also very interesting because like not everybody has the same. Some people feel very reluctant to share work in progress, right? They want to share like final projects.
It's a lot like science.
It's a little bit like science, but we're trying to like demystify, like, you know, making films, it's okay to share process. I mean, it's also like you need to curate what you want to show and what you don't want to show. Like maybe there are things that you don't want to show, but open up on the process because people are interested in that process. You know what I mean? Like others. They want to maybe see the film that you made, like, you know, Chemical Meadows that Nate made, but maybe they also want to learn a little. And it's not only about work in progress, it's also about like field notes. Like maybe there's an article or maybe there's a sound recording that you did in one of these like water, you know, these contaminated water. Like maybe there are things that you feel could enhance the viewing experience. A little bit like DVD bonus material, right? Like when you had DVDs before, you would be like, oh, there's like, I also did like DVD, like also like the director commenting over the film, like for the whole film. Remember that? Like DVD commenters,
But yeah, I don't know. Film is such a complex creation. There's so many things that go into it, and not all of them are visible in the final product. So being able to have a place to explore the underpinnings and the background and the extra information that was somehow left out, or, you know, just experiments, tests, other material, other footage, sound recordings. It's nice to be able to peel back the finished surface and see underneath all the parts that led to that, I guess.
And those notes are also fluctuating, right? Like maybe a final film would be sort of like once it's made, although we all go back and re-edit films sometimes, but it's sort of like static, right? But field notes, the idea is that it can evolve. Like maybe the notes that you submitted this moment, maybe you don't want them anymore. Maybe they're not like that relevant anymore, but maybe you want to like upgrade those. So it's user based, right? Like the user goes in there, or maybe the field notes were private and suddenly they become public, right? So one of the things that we're also like testing the audience, right? And testing how they feel about the work being online, about publishing field notes, and we get all kinds of reactions, right? People that are very excited about it, people that are very reluctant about it. And so one of the things was like, people asked like, is there an option to put a password protected? And so we decided to make that available. You know, if you want to have it behind a password and only share it with people that you want to share it with, then those are like more private field notes, but they're still field notes. Some people use it to pitch their movie, right? They're looking for funding. So it's like very standard, like pitch deck. This is the money we need. Some people use it. Everybody uses it differently. And it's really interesting to see that, you know, to see that process. And as Nate was saying, Labocine is also like a way of disrupting the streaming world and showing like, it's not only about the films that we make, it's about the ecosystem, the habitat, and the notes around it. And when you publish a scientific article, a lot of these like extra things, they're referred to as supplementary material. And I've always had issues with the word supplementary. It's like, what does that mean? Like, so field notes feels more like appropriate because it's like, these are notes, right? And sometimes the field notes become the film, right? Because it's a work in progress. So maybe you're showing like a scene and your film is in development. You can check like now, like you can say your film is in post-production and development. So that's where Labocine is heading into. It's like the video magazine is there, but I think what really is getting people, what really makes it exciting is all of the ways in which we can crossbreed people. And I was actually asking ChatGPT the other day, or like just that they oftentimes like, I'm just interested in like, they oftentimes refer to what we do as like very niche, but I don't see it as being that niche. Like there are so many people like anthropologists, filmmaker, everybody's doing work that's sort of hybrid between research and media. Like now more and more media, like filming, is a part of like a life of an anthropologist, psychologists, doctors. It's like, it's pretty, for me, it's like, it's actually I don't know if there's going to be like a cultural shift, but like this thing about it being very niche, I feel like is not accurate, but yeah.
Science is culture.
Science is culture.
Culture is science.
Both.
And every day we get people that sign up to Habitat, and every day I look at their profiles and I'm like blown away. Like it's like anthropologist and musician, or visual artist and, and these people are from all over the world, and it's sort of like LinkedIn, but like for these people that have multiple, you know what I mean? Like they have multiple titles, and so, so we're like thinking about ways, we're also thinking about ways to help filmmakers, and especially experimental work, how to get those projects to places, right? That's our goal, right? Because if you're an artist, you want to show it in festivals, but maybe you want to show it in museums, maybe you want to show it in public spaces. And there's a demand for that. There's a big demand, but there's a gap between you as an artist having to rely on like these festivals that it's great. It's a great opportunity to show your work. But sometimes like that's sort of like, it's like an experience and then it ends. There's a lot of universities that want to show experimental work in classrooms. Like if you're teaching a class on climate change or about like water contamination, why not show Nate's film instead of like showing like a VHS tape from like the 70s of like with David Attenborough? People want to see what artists are doing today, or maybe if talking about homelessness, like maybe they want to show your piece, So we're trying to find ways in which we can connect the work to these organizations, and feature films especially, there's a system in place called like sales agents and distributors, and they're not actually getting your films to they're getting them into festivals, and maybe they'll get you like a theatrical release in a movie theater. I mean, unlikely, but maybe they will.
So you're trying to provide more platforms for the filmmakers to distribute their films as well.
Worked with a lot of other institutions who come to us and say, oh, we want to show some films on this subject. And so then we know all these filmmakers and artists, and we could put together a program for them and get their work out to other places. We had a touring program for a little while that went, I think, went to other venues around the country with a selection of films from the festival. So we're always trying to find new ways beyond just the Science New Wave Festival to expand the reach of our filmmakers.
And curation is a big one, right? Like what Nate, curation is so important.
Oh yeah. We've moved from a sort of availability problem to a curation problem in terms of cultural production in general, where, 20 years ago, if you wanted to see a film that was, some experimental film, you just wouldn't have a way. It wouldn't be in a theater. It wouldn't be on television. Where are you going to find it? Nowadays, you can stream things, so everything is somewhere. It's a lot easier to find stuff. But how do you pick out of the vast majority, or the vast, everything on Vimeo, everything on YouTube? You have no idea where to start. So that's where curation comes in. It's
so important.
Helps you find things.
and especially important with short films, because like your experience of watching a short film, it becomes a meta film, because you're watching 7 films in a specific order, or maybe in a randomized order, depending on how you want to think about it. But that's the experience, right? And it's so important. Like when you're teaching a class, or when you're, I mean, curation is like, obviously when you go to an exhibit at the MoMA, or, you know, anywhere, there's curation, right? Like they're putting pieces side by side for you to think about how these relate to each other. And I think what Nate is saying is true. Like there's just so much quantity out there, but there's not enough curators.
Especially they're trying to, you know, there's movement towards algorithmic curation, which is not the same thing.
No.
It's having humans who actually think about how these things, how the emotional content of these two pieces work together, how the aesthetics work together. I don't know, a lot's lost when you just kind of match things up by keywords or whatever is happening.
Exactly, yeah.
What is your experience of curating this whole festival?
It's really all about trying to find the most exciting material and then finding a way to show it. So I go in without a lot of preconceived notions. I just try to watch. So we get a lot of things through submissions, but we also reach out to artists around the world to say, oh, do you have anything new? We'd like to see it. So the festival is curated as a mix of, just submissions that come into us that are surprises and things that we reach out to. But again, even when we're reaching out, it's not with a preconceived idea of where that will go. It's more like, let's just see the breadth of material being created in the world, and then find the ones that talk to each other, that reveal new things, that will connect with our audiences, and try to make the best program possible out of everything that exists that year.
And artists,
it's a long process.
Artists are also excited about curation. They're excited about their film being shown within a larger context. It's like, oh, my film is part of this, like, you know, about bird songs, or about, you know, about, they're like, they like this idea that it's like a curation, you know, it's not just like, oh, my festival is playing my movie on Friday night, you know.
Yeah, no, I get excited as a filmmaker, seeing what else I'm in a program with, and sometimes reaching out to those filmmakers, making new contacts that way, just because in some other part of the world I was in a program with somebody, even if I couldn't go.
Yeah.
It's still just really interesting.
Yeah, I had a great story about, like, I had made a movie about monarch butterflies, and they paired me up with a guy that made a film about, like, parachute. And it was just because, like, both films had to do with flight. And I was like, oh, that's such a it was such a strange Q&A, because it was about, like, just being in the air. But I was like, wow, that was a very interesting curation choice.
Well, you get a different conversation than you would if you were in the
exactly.
same kind of program.
Yeah,
every time,
I was like, okay, let's talk about, like, you know, free falling.
Free falling.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
It's amazing work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's hard work.
Yeah. Yeah, making like connections between different like films and creating a program out of it. And I'm sure that the artists or the filmmakers, scientists, they're all very excited to see like how their work is connecting the dots with another completely different context.
I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, all of these, I'm always very, like, excited about short films as well, because I feel like short films there's a lot more experimentation, and there's a lot more, like, you know, you don't have those constraints of making a feature film. But yeah, I think in addition to the film programs, we have this symbiosis initiative where science and filmmakers are going to meet for the first time, and they're going to make films over the course of the 8 days of the festival. This has been something that we've been doing over the years with the Simons Foundation. So they meet for the first time, they get randomly paired, and then they go off and make films, and then we show them on closing night. So yeah, it's a great event. So the closing night of the festival will be the 6 films that were made over 1 week. Yeah, and then Field Notes is another one, which is like what were we talking about? Works in progress, where we have a bunch of people that we've known over the years that have been part of the festival, that are going to talk, like Jennifer Reeves that's presenting this year. She was part of Field Notes last year. And I think she showed some of that piece, right?
She did, yeah. She talked about the piece that's now completed and showing this year. So.
You see, so that was like a field note that became like the film that we show. We're also very excited about like circulating through Science New Wave. So you may have been part of one like symbiosis, and then maybe you have a film that you made afterwards, or maybe you join the team on the programming committee. But Field Notes is a night where 6 artists or scientists are going to show works in progress. It can be at any stage. And it's sort of like we hear a little bit about their experience and where they are at and what they need, and and just kind of speaking about that.
Yeah,
that's on Saturday night.
Yeah, the 19th at DCTV.
Yeah.
And this Labocine website can host all of those programs that you talked about. So it's also available to people that not living in New York.
Not everything, but a lot of it.
A lot of it.
We do up to the filmmakers.
We ask the filmmakers. It's again we're testing these like questions around streaming. Not everybody has. Some people are highly enthusiastic. They're like, please include me in everything. Include me before the festival, after the festival. I want to be part of your plan. And some people are like, I don't want to be part of it. I only want to show in person. So we have all kinds of reactions.
Yes.
But around 2/3 of the films will be available, not all around the world. Mostly, like it's geo-blocked to the United States because of just the politics of festivals and. We can't just show it all over the world, but
a lot of these films are premieres, so they
a lot
haven't
of them
shown
are
anywhere
premieres.
yet.
Yeah,
So.
And so there is questions around like if it's a premiere, because you want to get distribution, and so you have to be careful about. But 2/3 of the film are going to be available online, and then right now we have another program which includes some of the films of the festival, but many more that we loved and we couldn't show. It's an issue called The Ecosystem, and it's something we did with Nate, where there's like 60 movies that are available all of October. And some incredible films are playing in that, and it's exciting because we can then films that we weren't able to show in the 64, we're able to show them there, and then a lot of these people create their habitat profile so we know who they are, and then we show their there's a lot. So Labocine is sort of like this support and trying to capture the artist, the scientist, the audience, and anybody that wants to be visible, they can create a habitat profile, right? If you're a volunteer, or if you're creating doing a podcast and you want people to know about yourself, then you can also create a habitat profile and do these things. So
it's really fun system because you also get your unique DNA code, right? Everybody who sign up for the membership.
Yeah. Also, there's always some confusion about all these trying to figure out it. But yeah, I think the idea is that if you become a member of the platform, you get a unique DNA code, and that identifies you. And we're still sort of trying to figure out what that means. But one of them is that you get a pass to go to the festival, to go to some screenings. But there's some things later on that we're kind of devising, right? What can be done with this Science New Wave ID? Maybe you can get into museums, or maybe you can get access to other things. It's sort of like your membership ID.
I'm going to get my DNA ID code spliced into my actual DNA and see what happens.
Exactly. You can splice it in, go to GenSpace. And I did have this thing where every film that gets selected in the festival also gets a unique DNA sequence that is composed of at least one person, usually the director, plus the 3 letters of that year's. It's like a 15 letter. And it's permanent. And so I had this idea, in the future we could archive all of the films that we've shown as DNA, because nowadays the future of storage. There was a film about this that we showed actually.
Oh, yeah.
And archiving is a lot of it. People are thinking about using DNA as a way of storage.
Yeah, it's very space efficient.
Yeah,
It's such a elaborate platform, but we are also at a very elaborate space. How do you imagine those members will come in and then create something here, really make connections, physical connections with this space?
Yeah, it's still work in progress. I mean, we just moved in here.
Yeah.
But I think one of the ideas was to have Science New Wave members propose things, right? And so making the space sort of available to them. Obviously, there is we have to financially be able to sustain being in a space like this. But we were also thinking about running workshops and screenings. We haven't really done screenings. We've done parties.
Yeah.
Which includes screenings.
We had the black, the little room there where we had screenings. So we're trying to do more of that. It's still kind of trying to figure out the identity of the space, but it really helps, I think, to have like a space where people can come together. And we also have a gallery in Paris, which is more for like, it's still in the early phase. I mean, but the idea is to show more like artwork that would be like video art, and we want to run like a residency where you can spend a few weeks and develop work there in Paris. And so this is all like in its early stages, but yeah, it would be a space to learn how to make like science films and like how to film through microscopes, how to, yeah. So, yeah.
You were proposing that we do a microscopy cyanotype workshop, which could be really interesting. So.
Yeah, I think more and more, I feel like having our members propose projects is sort of the way to go. You know, like we can enable it. We can also explain the reality of what it means to, you know, oh, you want to do this? Well, you know, this is what it would entail. But then having others propose projects, I think, or even screenings, you know. We want to do a magic lantern show here with
wow.
Melissa.
Yeah. I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah. That's like, and we wanted like it's. The other idea was that it's like a multi-purpose space. So it can be screening, it can be performance, and you know we can fit a lot of people here with chairs and stuff. And
Yeah, it's a giant and beautiful space.
Yeah, I
in
think
Gowanus. Yeah.
But it's all like relatively new. But I do feel like having a space is important. But yeah, and more and more like having the members, right? Better term than like users, of like the members propose projects, or maybe people that are coming through New York. You know, like somebody comes and says like, oh, I'm coming through New York for a week, and maybe it's like, oh, let's host like a little talk. Could also be a talk, right? Where you talk about your work. So that's the idea of it.
So talk about more abstract stuff. So from the first time that you did this collaborative film screening or collaborations with scientists and artists in Rockefeller University until now, we're in Gowanus and having a film festival like upon us. Like, has your vision changed, or has your vision developed throughout the years, and what is your experience and your feelings about it? Yeah.
For me, I think it really crystallized when we started Symbiosis, which was back in 2014, I think, because that was when we went from just being a platform and a space for filmmaker and scientist collaborations, or for scientists who are filmmakers, or filmmakers who are scientists, or whatever else. But then it was really fostering that. Yeah. It was encouraging people to work together and go in new directions that maybe they weren't going to go on their own, and just really explore the possibilities of those collaborations. So that's been going now for 10 years somehow.
I don't know how. When I think about the extent of time this has been going, it like blows my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not getting any younger. But I think I feel like yes, like finding ways where we can help these crossbreeding, like symbiosis, on a larger scale, helping scientists and artists and filmmakers meet, collaborate, because I feel like there's a lot of interests, and it's not always easy to meet, you know, like a scientist, or, I mean, it's changing a lot, but I feel like that's where I feel like it's heading, right?
Well, and that's partly what the Science New Wave Fund, which has only been around for a couple of years, that's about fostering those collaborations directly too, just giving support, right?
And also giving support to projects that can be, because many funding agencies, like they require like a certain format, you know, like feature film, or it has to be like this is like really, we're really interested in like what exactly our fund, how it can help you kind of get to the next stage, you know, and it can be live performance, it can be an interactive piece, it can be a feature documentary, it can be science fiction. So we're really interested in you articulating like, what about the Science New Wave? Apart from obviously the money, is many people need money, but like, what is our ecosystem? How can it help you? And so Nate was part of that. That's something that we hope to do. But of course, all of these things, another thing that I think a lot about is like sustainability, right? Like, how do we sustain, how do we keep existing? How do we also provide compensation? But with Labocine, we're trying to like then get these films, like we'll get contacted, and more it's happening by like a university, and we'll ask them like, what's your budget? And they'll say like, oh, we can run like for $7,000, and then we obviously compensate the artists and the filmmakers. Like we're trying to create like a market, right? But not like maybe like the market that's in the Cannes Film Festival or others, like a market where people can really see what are the films of the Science New Wave. And we sometimes see the films that are selected here, they go on to other places. But it's important to think about compensation, providing funding, and just trying to figure out a way in which we can help artists survive and scientists. So
yeah. Very important questions. I mean, I think everybody is interested in this question. Yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed that like as I get a lot of people coming on Labocine, that many artists and filmmakers, I mean, it's not a secret, but like most of these people are professors, right? This is how artists are able to sort of function for the most part. Like they're affiliated as lecturers, or it's an interesting like survival mechanism, right? That the professorship has become, but it's just very hard to sustain a living as an artist standalone, So how can we make that, how can we play a role in that, and there's a lot of scientific organizations that have a lot of money. If you show a film at IBM, or if you show a film at these are foundations that are interested in science communication that have the pockets to then support these films and visual pieces. And so it's just a matter of connecting them because they're interested, they want more of that programming. We have the films, we have the people, and it's just like, how do we bridge that gap? And we're getting closer to that.
I have some wild thought. Maybe in the future, there would be a Labocine residency, but I mean, to ask scientists and artists living together, I don't know, maybe roommate or maybe co-living working spaces for a few months or even 2 years, and to see what things come out of it.
Just what will organically grow from proximity.
We wanted to do something where like we would organize Science New Wave gatherings in different cities. So like in Buenos Aires or in Berlin, like because if you type right now in Habitat Berlin, you have like hundreds of people that are based there. So like find ways of, and there's a lot of scientists like from the Max Planck Institute, from all these places, because Berlin is like an amazing place also for arts and science. So just like figuring out ways where people can meet, and then of course, providing residencies, but like little meetups, and just being like, oh, you're a Science New Wave member, I'm also, and like, have you shared work on Labocine? Like, oh, maybe I'm going to see your work and your animations that you've done, your piece of work in progress in the subway about. And then we also learn about each other through the work that we make, the audio visual work, but it can be like scientific experiments, because we have this thing called scenes. There's so much going on. But you know about scenes? No. Scenes are like little, they're not films, but they're little like glimpses into videos that you've produced like in the lab. Like maybe you shot something under the microscope that's like 10 seconds long. We call them scenes,
It's a little like field notes in that
it's a little bit like
looking at the process that sometimes gets lost in the product. So, you film all kinds of things in a lab, it's part of your data, and maybe, it becomes one footnote in a paper, but then no one gets to see it. So sometimes that the visual information is just really fascinating on its own. What you were saying, where you don't need any explanation. Sometimes just the qualities of the object itself are enough and really interesting. So.
Yeah.
And I really like your idea that you said that maybe you can foster this kind of community in different parts of the world.
We've always wanted to take symbiosis to other places.
Yeah, I mean, we used to run with Nate, like, we had 3 festivals running for a few years in 3 different cities. We had New York, Paris, and Abu Dhabi. Like, we did that for like 2-3 years.
Yeah.
So it was like different times of the year, like February in Abu Dhabi, summer in Paris, and then fall in New York. I don't know how we like survived that, but it was fun because in each one of these places, there's a specific culture, right? And a specific way of approaching arts and science and then crossbreeding, right? Having people from different countries come to New York or go to Abu Dhabi, or we had funding in Abu Dhabi, so we would bring artists there for like a week, and they would show works in progress, and so much fun.
Oh wow, I would love to come to Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, it was crazy because it was like being like on a spaceship, and we would have like these amazing artists and scientists and filmmakers. And,
Well, that's really a beautiful process. Would you be so generous and give some notes to our audiences who also want to start a program like this? Maybe not bringing science and art together, maybe bringing culinary experience and like visual art together or something else. Like, what would be your little note to them?
You want to start?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a big question. I think you just have to be passionate about the thing you want to do, and then it's a lot of work, but start small and just build up and see that you have build a community, I guess is actually the best way.
But I've seen you too. I've seen like great partners, like you're supporting each other in a way which is helping each other to foster this community. Do you think like finding collaborators or finding the right collaborator also very important process in this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think collaborators can also be the people that are part of the community, right? I think this idea that we mentioned, that there's like kind of like circulation, that it's not like, the collaborators may have been people that have been part of the festival, maybe a volunteer is now part of symbiosis. There's just like free circulation through an organization, I think is important, like not having this like stratified, like these are our sponsors, these are, I think community is definitely like a big part of that, which is, and I think you also have to have some level of like understanding like the entrepreneur part of it, like, organization, like how do you create an organization? What is a good sort of status for that organization? Is it a nonprofit? Like you have to think about these things because they are important.
How did you learn about this?
I still don't understand it fully, to be honest. It's sort of like you sort of learn in the, like usually film festivals are nonprofits because you get support, but it's always been very hard for me to find those governmental supports and city supports. I've always been really bad at that, at getting those.
Well, I would say that if you're starting a film festival or something like that, don't try to make money off of it because it's very hard. And there's lots of festivals that are there to make money, and I think they're, kind of scams. they're just taking submission fees from people and trying to get as many artists to submit to them who might not get very much out of that interaction at all. Your film might be in a program online that no one watches or something. So yeah, I don't know. Do it because you love it, not because you think it's going to be a business venture, I'd have to say.
Yeah.
That's a very different perspective. You were talking about being an entrepreneur. You were talking about...
Well, I think like the Labocine had a little bit of that business edge to it. Like, you really want to be part of this? Then pay $30 a year. I was sort of getting like aggravated by like, ultimately we all need to survive. So like if you can just pay a few dollars a year to sustain this. If somebody, for example, applies for a fund, I'm not naming any names, and then doesn't get the fund and immediately cancels their subscription. I mean, it's okay. I totally understand it. I may do the same myself, but I understand that their motivation for being part of the community is for a very specific request, and then that's it. They don't want like long-lasting, or maybe they come back a year and they're like, oh, actually, I see the value now, and I'll, So I think it's important. I think community-based support, so that we can then because when we program films on Labocine, we pay them. I mean, typically when we run an issue, every film gets compensation. Not that much, but it's symbolic. But and that money comes from the people that are paying a membership per year to watch them. So that was why I created that entity, right? It's like, or when we get your films into museums or galleries, well, maybe we'll take a little commission, because we're helping you with curation, we're helping you make that connection, but we're also compensating you.
Yeah, those are great opportunities to give back to the filmmaker in a really direct way. That
Yeah.
Maybe the festival can't, but a museum, once we've linked those up, they can, and that's a great opportunity. And
So I think that's important. I think I realize that goes a long way in terms of keeping us or allowing us to survive than relying on 2 or 3 individuals that give us like $20,000 or $30,000 a year and just kind of like making sure that they're going to renew their part. No, let's just make it about the community. Everybody give $30. If we can get 10,000 people doing that, that's a lot of money. So my goal, because with Nate, like we both make films, my goal is that we could produce films, which we've done also. I mean, we've done it all, but we did it like in our 10th year, we produced like a 10-part series. But that would be the goal, is to produce like original content and pay people a little bit like the Science New Wave Fund, but pay them to be part of like a series, which is done by other organizations. Like right now, Sandbox Films, I don't know if you've heard of them. They're an organization production company that specializes in science documentary that is funded by the Simons Foundation. And they're doing something with the New York Times right now where they're making short films about the elements in the periodic table, like different elements,
There's been a few of those projects before.
There has
That's
been,
funny,
and I think we've shown some.
Yeah.
But so, everybody chooses like an element, like copper or boron, and they're making films about it.
I think we showed copper and lithium from another periodic table film
Right.
compilation like years ago. So
Yeah, and we started to do that with scenes, but scenes is a little bit more like realistic, where we ask people to shoot for us.
Yes.
And we're gonna do more. So those are like a little bit more, because it's basically you just have to shoot like a continuous 1 hour. But we have another one right now which is about museums, which is like it's basically like 12 shot, like Pechakucha. Have you heard of Pechakucha? It's basically a format. You have 20 slides, or 20 can be slides or videos, and each one of them can only last 20 seconds. And so your film is 20 times 20. It's like a form of presentation. I like these like constraints. So the idea is to shoot 20 static shots of a museum. There's like a whole thing like on Labocine with very little human activity. They can be like floating, or you could hear 20 times 20. And they're called museum portraits. And it's about like documenting museums around the world. And we got 3 already.
Oh, wow.
And we got one in like in Scripps in California, and they're amazing. I mean, it's just 20 times 20.
Beautiful program. I think this is such a beautiful journey. I learned so many things about.
And you're part of it. You're a Science New Wave member.
Yeah, exactly.
You're a luminary, actually, which is like people that contribute
Yes.
to the Science New Wave. Like by doing this, you're part of it. You're invested in it, which is like our status for.
I really hope that I can help to promote this like amazing festival and amazing space, so more people can know about it, and most importantly can participate in it, like intellectually, physically, and be part of it. Thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for listening and watching, and I will see you every week, and we are available on YouTube Podcasts, YouTube Music, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Pocket Podcasts. So see you next week. Ciao, ciao.